just that we're going to see it and I want you to understand it. It's also that these are critical to the foundational trust and that we have in the Bible, that the Bible's right and that the Bible's accurate, and that the copies of the Bible we have they have veracity to them or trustworthiness. So let's go back to 1947. 1947, a couple of Bedouin kids are wandering around down near the Dead Sea, and you'll see when we get there that there's all kinds of natural caves there by the hundreds. And so, you know how we throw rocks across the water and they skip? Well, they throw rocks in caves. And so they were throwing rocks in caves, and normally you throw a rock in a cave and it goes clunk. Well, they threw one in here and it went clink. And so they crawled into the cave and they found some clay jars, and in the jars were some scrolls rolled up. Well, they really didn't know what they had. The rock had hit one of these clay jars. So they really didn't know what they had. They came back that evening with their fathers. They pulled the scrolls out. These turned out to be the 5 scrolls from Cave 1. The caves are numbered by the order in which they were discovered. So Cave 1 was simply discovered first, then Cave 2, Cave 3, okay? We've discovered major caches, major collections of scrolls in 11 caves, but there have been some occasional finds, but mostly 11 different caves. Okay, so what do you do with these scrolls? Well, they didn't know what they had. They looked to be Hebrew and ancient, but they really didn't know what they had. And so they took these scrolls to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem named Mr. Kando, K-A-N-D-O. He looked at them, wasn't sure what they were either, and at the time, this was 1947, this was before the partitioning of Israel. This was before the War of Independence. The American Schools of Oriental Research had an outpost here, and the guy in charge of it was a fellow named John Trevor, T-R-E-V-E-R. And so Mr. Kando, this Palestinian antiquities dealer, took the scrolls to John Trevor, who was in charge of the American Schools of Oriental Research here in Jerusalem, to find out what he had. John Trevor immediately called Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore to talk to a fellow named William F. Albright. Any of you guys ever heard of William F. Albright? The most famous American archaeologist ever to live, and fairly conservative, all things considered, you know, biblically conservative. Methodist, I mean, we won't hold that against him, but he was very conservative. And so it was a Wednesday afternoon, and that's where I did my graduate work, and so I know the schedule. Every Wednesday afternoon we have seminars. So for 2 hours, the whole class, the whole department sits with the professors. That's when the phone call came in from John Trevor in Jerusalem, and he said, "I've got this scroll in front of me, Dr. Albright, and I'm not 100% sure what I got." And so Albright said, read it to me, one letter at a time. And it turned out what he had in front of him was the great Isaiah scroll, an entire scroll of all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And he called one of his graduate students out of the seminar, Albright did, to come in and write the letters on the chalkboard, one by one in Albright's office, as Trevor was reading them over the phone from Jerusalem. So you got the picture. Trevor's reading the scroll and telling him this letter, this letter, this letter. Albright's repeating it, and the graduate student's writing it on the chalkboard. Everybody got the picture? The graduate student was a fellow named Dr. Sam Ivry, who taught me when I was there. And the reason I know this is true is because we heard this story at least once a week. You know what I'm saying? Old Jewish guy, and I know this story. So Trevor is reading this, and he read about 5 lines of the book of Isaiah, and Albright says to him, "You have this scroll, right, in front of you. You have this actual scroll." And Trevor says, "Yes, I do." And Albright said, "You have in front of you the greatest archaeological discovery in history." And how did Albright know that? Well, the guy was brilliant. I mean, he could look at the Hebrew letters, he could look at the morphology and the syntax and the way the Hebrew was being written, and I don't have time to give you all the details, but you can look at Hebrew down through the centuries, and by the way it's written, by the way the vowel points are in there, by the way certain letters combine with others, you can get a sense of how old or from what period that Hebrew language is from. For example, if we look at the Declaration of Independence, you know how it has that huge big S at the end? Everybody know what I'm talking about? Well, we don't use that anymore. So if somebody brought you a document with one of those big old S's on it, you could look at it and say, I don't know exactly when this is from, but it's at least a couple hundred years old, because that's the way they wrote in 1700, but they don't write English like that anymore. You understand? Well, Hebrew's the same way, except it's a lot older than English. Okay, so he said to John Trevor, get that scroll. I don't care what you have to pay for it, get that scroll. Well, once you tell a Bedouin it was worth something, that was a bad mistake, because he tried, instead of being cool, Trevor went to Mr. Kando and said, whatever you want, I'll pay you. Big mistake. So Kando said, no. Roll the scroll up, and went to leave, and Trevor said, well, look, at least before you leave, can I photograph it? And he said, all right. And so there's actually, you can get the book today. I have a copy of the Great Isaiah Scroll and John Trevor's photographs of every single piece of parchment. The scrolls are parchment that are sewn together, of every single column of parchment, and he did it on a bright red background. It's spectacular, the photographs, and you can still get it. You can still buy the book. It's not inexpensive, but you can buy it. All right, so then Mr. Kando took the scroll and left. Then the War of Independence broke out. Well, when the War of Independence broke out, the Arabs in Bethlehem and the Jews in Israel were not exactly friends. So we lost track of the scrolls. Nobody knew where they went. And what had actually happened is Mr. Kando had sold them to the Metropolitan, that's like a bishop, of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Damascus, and had gotten more money than Trevor had offered him. What he didn't know is if he'd have come back to Trevor would have paid him anything he wanted. But the war had broken out, and that line of communication was no longer in existence. He couldn't walk from Bethlehem into Israel. There was a war going on. You understand what I'm saying? 1948. Okay, so he sold them to the Syrian bishop, Metropolitan, and this guy brought him to America. I'm giving you the real short version of this. Brought him to America and put an ad in the Wall Street Journal to sell these 5 scrolls. This is a true story. Ancient scrolls called Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, and a phone number in the Wall Street Journal. Well, the Israelis had heard. This was 1949, so the war was over. The Israelis had heard that the scrolls were in New York. They didn't know where, and they were looking, and someone noticed this in the paper, and so they wanted to buy the scrolls, obviously, but they knew that the war had changed politics and that the Syrians would never sell the Israelis anything. You with me? So they had to get a go-between, and they found a gentleman that was teaching at Hebrew Union College named Dr. Harry Orlinsky, Jewish man, American, to kind of be a go-between and see if he could purchase the scrolls for Israel. I had the privilege when I was studying at Hopkins of not only hearing Dr. Orlinsky give us a lecture, but he flew into BWI, and they asked me, since I drove up from D.C. to classes, to pick him up. And what a privilege to ride with this guy in the car. And he, when I asked him about this story, is it really true? And he said it really is. So his name was Mr. Green. They named him Mr. Green. If you'd have seen Dr. Orlinsky, they should have named him Mr. Greenberg. You understand what I'm saying? But Mr. Green, and he went to negotiate for the scrolls and was able to purchase all 5 scrolls, including the whole book of Isaiah, for $250,000. Now this was 1949. That's a lot of money, but these scrolls are priceless. I mean, that was a bargain. Well, and so they came here to Israel. Now they change what's on display down here from time to time. The Great Isaiah Scroll used to be on display. I think they've taken that down because they can't leave these scrolls out in the light and in the air too much, or the writing begins to fade. You know, the only reason these scrolls were as well preserved as they are is because they were down by the Dead Sea, where it never rains and where the relative humidity is like 2%. You understand what I'm saying? So you bring them here, even in climate-controlled situations, you just can't keep them out in the light and in the humidity much. So they rotate the scrolls. I'm not sure quite. The Psalm scroll used to be on display. When I was here in April, they had taken that down. So I'm not really quite sure what's on display now. But anyway, those were the first 5 scrolls. Well, when the Bedouin found out that there was gold in them thar hills, you understand what I'm saying? Man, they went back there looking for scrolls. And so they were the ones who have scoured literally thousands of caves along the Dead Sea and have found 10 other caves where y'all cold?
No.
Okay. Well, this is still a good story, even if you're cold. So we found 10 other caves with scrolls in them. And have found somewhere between, nobody exactly knows, but somewhere between 10 and 40,000 either fragments. I mean, a lot of the stuff they found are this big with 6 letters on it. You know, that not everything they found were whole huge scrolls like the Isaiah scroll. That was a bonus. But they have found a scroll of the book of Jeremiah from 250 BC. The Great Isaiah scroll is dated to 50 BC. The Psalm scroll, the Isaiah scroll is dated to 100 BC. The Psalm scroll is dated to 50 BC. Every one of these scrolls is dated before the time of Christ. You with me? All right. And we found evidence of every single book in the Bible but Esther. And I think the only reason we haven't found Esther is for the first 50 years, it's 6 scholars. That's it. Controlled all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And would only let people have access to them that they wanted. And you know, if you're a scholar, it's publish or die, right? Yeah. And so they wouldn't let anybody have access to these. They wanted to publish them. Now, these were all old guys. I mean, they were never going to get to publish all this stuff. We're talking 10,000 fragments. Finally, there was a class action lawsuit about 10 years ago that was won that forced them to give public access to the scrolls. And now a lot of people are working on the scrolls. Now they're digitized and you can get access to them online. So they're going to find the book of Esther, trust me. It's just, you know, it really is just the luck of the draw. It hasn't been found yet. Okay, so what is the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, here's the bottom line. The bottom line is people will often say to you, you know, the Bible we're reading today is not even the same Bible as what originally was written. I mean, down through the centuries, it's been changed, it's been rewritten. How do we even know the Bible we have today is the same Bible that was original? Well, up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we could only go back to the Aleppo Codex. I sent you an article on the Aleppo Codex. Did you read it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, that's dated to the 900s AD. And that was the oldest copy of the Old Testament we had. So we could go back to 900 AD, and we could say, well, at least we know between 900 and 2000, the Bible has not changed. But that's only back to 900. You with me? That's not that far. All of a sudden, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've leapfrogged 1,000 years in the transmission and the history of the Hebrew Bible and gone all the way back before the time of Christ with the Hebrew Bible. You guys with me? Okay, so when we look at these scrolls, when you take the Great Isaiah scroll, I had privilege of studying it for a year at Hopkins, and you roll that out and you put the copy of Isaiah we have in Hebrew next to it today, I mean, they are identical. I mean, there's an occasional and or an occasional vowel marker that's a little different, but for all practical purposes, They are identical. The one from 100 BC and the one you're reading in your English Bible today are the same. That's incredible to be able to go back now before the time of Christ on all of these books and be able to say, no, at least before the time of Christ, at least 200 BC, we know that the Bible we're reading today, the Old Testament, is the very same one that was back then. Now, can we go to 1000 BC? No, we don't have anything quite that old. But one thing we know is that the Jewish people took the transmission of the Old Testament so seriously that if from 200 BC till today, that they guarded it and guarded its truthfulness and its accuracy, there is a logical assumption that they did the very same thing before 200 BC leading up. Does that make sense? Yeah. When you copy a scroll today, like the book of Genesis, at the end of the book of Genesis, in a Hebrew scroll, there is a count of every word in the book of Genesis and every letter in the book of Genesis. And when you finish it, when a scribe finishes, a Hebrew scribe, they have to count. For it to be kosher, they have to count every word and they have to count every letter. And if they're one word short, or if they are one letter short, they have to destroy the scroll. It can't be used. And if you ever read a Hebrew Bible, at the end, I'm telling you, at the end of each book, down in the fine print is the total words and the total letters that should be there. And before a scroll can be used in the synagogue, it's got to be exact. So with that kind of transmission, I think we can trust that if from 200 to 2000, things were translated that accurately and transmitted that accurately, they certainly did it before that. Now, furthermore, it even gets better, because people will often say that the greatest proof that Christ is who he said he is fulfilled prophecy. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. We have some prophecy from the Psalms that are 1,000 years old. We have some prophecy even from before the Psalms that are older than 1,000 years. We have a lot of prophecies from the book of Isaiah, from the book of Jeremiah, from the minor prophets. All of these prophecies, more than 30 prophecies of the Lord Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, his ministry, and he fulfilled every single one of them. We had a mathematician at McLean Bible Church who figured out for me that the probability of that happening was 1 times 10 with 100 zeros behind it. Now, I don't even know what that exactly is. I don't have a word, 1 sexa, giga, trillion, or whatever it is. But that means it can't be by chance. I mean, 1 times 10 with 100 zeros? I mean, come on. That can't be chance. And so when we say to people, fulfilled prophecy is the proof that Jesus is who he said he is, then we have to be able to justify that that prophecy really did come from before Christ. You with me? Yep. Now, there are 2 ways people get around this. I'm talking about liberal scholars. The first way they get around it is they say, well, wait a minute. What, don't you understand what happened? The disciples, after Jesus lived his life, they looked at his life and they said, okay, he was crucified. They put nails in his hands. They gave him vinegar to drink. And they went back and they rewrote the Old Testament. They rewrote Psalm 22. They rewrote the book of Isaiah. They rewrote all these prophecies to make them in line with the life of Jesus. In other words, they retrofitted the Old Testament to fit the life of Jesus, and it's all a sham. It's a hoax. You understand? Now, we know that's not true if Christ has changed our life. But up until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we couldn't prove it. The oldest copy we had of the Old Testament was 900 AD. We couldn't prove that we can't prove they're wrong. Now, we can prove they're wrong. Because now we have copies going before Christ. You heard what I said, BC. Didn't you hear that?
Yeah.
So before Jesus was ever born, we've got the Isaiah scroll. We got the Psalm scroll. We got the book of Jeremiah. And they all read exactly the way your book of Jeremiah and Isaiah and the Psalms read today, meaning Nobody went back and changed the Old Testament to retrofit it to the life of Christ. We have copies before Jesus was born that say, they pierce my hands and my feet, that say your Holy One shall not see corruption, etc., etc. You with me? So if somebody ever says to you, hey, you know what? They just went back and changed the Bible. Please feel free to say to them in a nice way, you know what? You are ignorant. You're not. You don't know the facts. You don't know what you're talking about. That cannot happen. That is positively a ridiculous thing to say. Okay? I say it nice. But that's the truth. All right. You say, well, now wait a minute. Wait a minute. But what if it happened the other way around? I mean, what if Jesus read all of the prophecies in the Old Testament and said, hey, I'll just live my life, so I do all these things, you know, like I'll talk the Romans into crucifying me, you know, I'll go beg Pontius Pilate to crucify me, and then I'll beg them to cast lots for my clothing, you know, hanging on the cross. I'll say, hey fellas, would you all do me a favor down there? Will you cast lot for my clothes? Because the Psalm, you know, it says in the book of Zechariah they got to do that. And fellas, could y'all give me some of that vinegar? Because it says in Psalm 69, they got to do that. And hey fellas, and you understand what I'm saying? And then, and so the point is that he lived his life in an artificial way to try to fulfill all the prophecies. So it really isn't a true fulfillment. It's that the Lord Jesus jerked his life around to fit the prophecies. Everybody with me? That's the other approach that liberals take. Well, maybe he could have done some of that. I mean, maybe he could go and bribe Pilate to crucify him. Maybe he could talk the soldiers into please, you know, giving him some vinegar. Maybe. But folks, how in the world did he talk Caesar Augustus into having a census of the world that forced his mother to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem to fulfill Micah chapter 5 when he was still in the womb? Big problem. Big problem. Big problem. Now, come on. There's no way that Jesus could have done that. So, let's go back to our bottom line. If there's no way his disciples could have gone back and retrofitted the prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament, which we know they couldn't, and if there's no way Jesus could have jerked every part of his life around to fulfill every one of these prophecies, then we're back to 1 times 10 with 100 zeros after it, right? Yeah. And I don't know about you, but when I got odds like that, that can't possibly be wrong. It can't possibly be wrong. And so one of the things, I mean, we give our life to Christ and Jesus changes our life, and we know he's real because of what he does in our heart. But it's also great to have some intellectual backing up of what we believe. And I'll put 1 times 10 with 100 zeros up against anybody, anytime. That just cannot be wrong. So I want your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ to be strong, and I want you to understand that it's not just based on the subjective part of what he's done in your life, but I mean, when we start really looking at the facts, the fact that Jesus is who he said he is stacks up with the evidence. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are critical in allowing us to say, no, they didn't go back and change the Old Testament. Everybody understand? I mean, that is rock solid, no way in the world, and that's why they're so important. And you say, well, does everybody agree that they're that old? Yep. Even liberal scholars who don't like to agree that they're that old are forced to, and there's no argument about the age of these scrolls. So, we good?
We're good.
All right, that's the fastest course in the Dead Sea Scrolls you're ever going to get in your whole life. All right, but you got it now. You understand why these are so important. And what you see behind you is a replica of what the top of one of those first jars were that were discovered. When you go in, when you're walking down the hallway to go into the main room, look to your left at the very end of the hallway, and you'll see one of those ceramic clay pots where the book of Isaiah, the scroll of Isaiah was found, and that's what the top looks like. So that's why they designed it like this, you know, with